The morning sun slipped past wisps of mist, spilling over cobblestones and freshly whitewashed walls. Gardens neat as pin-cushions buzzed with the quiet industry of bees. And in her small but meticulously tended garden, Miss Marple crouched near a bed of late roses, prying out weeds that dared encroach. Her gloves, once cream, bore the marks of countless mornings like this, though her hat, practical and sensible, remained spotless. "Morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Petherick from across the low stone wall. Her voice, like an old kettle, whistled and rattled in equal measure. Dressed in a flowered apron, Mrs. Petherick came bearing the latest news as one might a fresh-baked pie, warm, inviting, with an undertone of mischief. "Good morning, Mrs. Petherick," Miss Marple replied, pulling off her gloves with a practised tug. "Lovely weather, though I suspect it won't last. My knees always seem to know before the forecast does." "Oh, I do envy you that trick," Mrs. Petherick sighed. "My Albert can't even tell when the kettle's boiled unless it whistles in his face." She paused, glancing up the road. "But I didn't come to talk about the weather, though heaven knows we could use a break from all this talk of tragedy. Did you hear about Lady Hensley? Such a dreadful business with her husband. Plane crash, they say. Fancy that. Him, of all people." Miss Marple nodded, though her lips remained a thin line. "Accidents are curious things, Mrs. Petherick. They happen suddenly, but there's always a thread if you tug hard enough." Mrs. Petherick looked momentarily unsettled, glancing at the approaching figure of Mr. Green, the village postman, whose uniform bore the wear of many years, but whose step remained brisk. "Well, I won't keep you. Just thought I'd say hello. Mustn't linger, or people will talk, though Lord knows they do anyway." With a quick wave she ambled off. Mr. Green offered Miss Marple a nod. "Morning, Miss Marple, got something for you. Bit fancier than usual. Seal, too, black wax, looks important." Miss Marple accepted the envelope, her fingers grazing the textured parchment. "Thank you, Mr. Green, and do give my regards to your mother. I hear her rhubarb's come in splendidly this year." "Aye, that it has," Mr. Green grinned. "If she had her way, she'd plant it on the roof. Good day, ma'am." As he departed, Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the envelope. A heavy cream stock, the seal an ornate crest pressed in black wax. Her thumb traced it thoughtfully. Lady Eleanor Hensley was not a woman given to dramatics. For her to resort to something as theatrical as black sealing wax meant the matter was grave indeed. The parlour at Miss Marple's cottage was a reflection of the woman herself, neat, unobtrusive, and full of quiet character. Lace doilies, embroidered by her own steady hands, softened the edges of dark wood furniture. The grandfather clock, a faithful if opinionated companion, ticked with steady purpose. She set the envelope on the small table beside her chair, fetched her letter-opener, silver, modest, a gift from a grateful neighbour, and carefully sliced through the wax. The paper inside was thick, the handwriting precise, no unnecessary flourishes, practical, like the woman who wrote it. "Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you in good health. I write under difficult circumstances. My husband, Sir Alister, as you may have heard, perished recently in what the authorities have deemed an accident. Yet I find myself troubled by certain inconsistencies, matters I cannot discuss openly. I would be grateful if you would call upon me at Hensley Manor at your earliest convenience. Your discretion, as always, is valued beyond words. Yours sincerely." Lady Eleanor Hensley, Miss Marple, read it twice, frowning slightly. She was no stranger to the peculiarities of human nature, nor to the murky waters of genteel society where decorum often drowned out truth. Sir Alister Hensley, brilliant, eccentric, and, if gossip served, not without enemies. His ventures into communications technology had drawn both admiration and suspicion, though in St.Mary Mead ambition was often viewed with as much suspicion as scandal. Folding the letter, she reached for her tea, now lukewarm. Inconsistencies. Such a polite way to describe what more often than not boiled down to deceit and desperation. She glanced out the window at the village beyond. So peaceful, so ordinary, yet beneath that charm secrets brewed like strong tea left too long in the pot. Miss Marple set down her cup with quiet resolve. "Accidents," she murmured to herself, "rarely happen without reason, and people, bless them, always think they're better at hiding things than they are." It was decided then. Hensley Manor awaited, and with it, no doubt, a tangle of lies wrapped up in truth, just waiting for someone to pull the right thread. Miss Marple sat in her armchair, the well-worn cushion moulding comfortably beneath her. The teacup in her hand, a delicate piece with a faded floral pattern, steamed gently. Outside, the village settled into its afternoon lull. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. The clock ticked in steady defiance of the creeping quiet. Her gaze drifted to the letter on the table. Lady Eleanor Hensley, proper to a fault, yet never prone to fuss unless warranted, and Sir Alister. Now there was a man who stirred conversation in every sitting-room and shop-front, from here to the next parish. Brilliant, they said. Some muttered about the sort of brilliance that burns too hot and sets everything around it ablaze. An inventor, Mrs. Petterick once whispered over the bread counter. But what kind of man needs to wire his house like a telegraph station? Nonsense, if you ask me. Dangerous, tinkering with things best left alone. Miss Marple sipped her tea. It had gone tepid, but she barely noticed. Sir Alister was never one for village fetes or charity teas, preferred his machines and blueprints to people, though when he spoke it was with a charm that could smooth the sharpest edges. At least when he wanted it to. She remembered the gossip from 2 summers back, when young Tommy Hill claimed to have seen lights flashing in the Hensleys' greenhouse at midnight. "Like a storm bottled up in there," he'd said. His mother had dragged him to the vicar to make him recant, but stories like that don't die easy in places like St.Mary Mead. Her lips curled in a half-smile. People, she thought, always underestimate how much they reveal when they think they're keeping secrets. And secrets, well, they were like weeds. Left alone, they sprouted in every corner. She set her teacup down with a soft clink. There was a pull to this business, something beyond the polite distress of a widow. Inconsistencies. Not a word Lady Eleanor would use lightly. No, this wasn't just about grief or appearances. It was about something rotten beneath the surface. Miss Marple's eyes settled on the small notebook beside the letter. She opened it, neat handwriting marking the pages, notes on village matters mostly, but her mind, sharp and orderly, had already begun spinning a web. Connections forming, questions layering over one another. Why the Black Seal? Why her, of all people? Not that she hadn't been drawn into trouble before. It was always the same. Someone thinking they could outsmart everyone else, too proud to realize. Pride often paved the quickest road to ruin. She stood smoothing her skirt and glanced at the clock. Plenty of time before supper. Her resolve was quiet but firm. Curiosity was a dangerous thing, some said, but it was curiosity that often got to the truth faster than bluster or bravado. As she reached for her coat, Miss Marple murmured to herself, "People do love to believe accidents just happen, but that's the thing about accidents, isn't it? Someone's usually responsible, whether they admit it or not." Hensley Manor stood like a sombre sentinel against the grey sky, its stone walls weathered, ivy coiling up like dark veins. Miss Marple stepped out of the hired car, her practical shoes crunching on the gravel drive. The air smelled of damp earth and old money. She paused to glance at the towering windows, shuttered with holding secrets. Her fingers brushed the lapel of her coat, a simple gesture of composure. The door opened before she reached it. Parker, the butler, lean and pale, offered a polite nod. "Miss Marple, her ladyship is expecting you." Inside, the manor seemed to swallow sound. Heavy curtains turned day into perpetual dusk, and the thick carpet muted her steps. The drawing-room smelled faintly of lavender polish and something less pleasant. Grief, or maybe fear. Lady Eleanor Hensley rose from an armchair near the hearth, dressed in black that looked less like mourning and more like armour. Her figure was slim, posture ramrod straight. The only concession to vulnerability was a slight tremor in her hand as she gestured to a seat. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," Lady Eleanor said. voice clipped yet weary. Her eyes, sharp green, had seen more than they admitted. "It was no trouble," Miss Marple replied, settling into a chair that swallowed her petite frame. Her gaze flicked to the room's details, portraits of ancestors glaring from gilt frames, a clock on the mantel ticking with morbid patience, and fresh black crepe draped across the windows. "A lovely home," she remarked, "though I imagine it feels emptier now." Lady Eleanor's lips thinned. "Emptier, yes, and noisier, with whispers I'd rather not hear. The official story is an accident." "I'm not so certain." Miss Marple nodded, knitting needles absent but her mind weaving none the less. "Accidents often turn out to be quite deliberate when one looks closely. What leads you to doubt, Lady Eleanor?" Lady Eleanor's gaze dropped to her gloved hands. "Alistair was careful to the point of madness. He wouldn't have taken unnecessary risks with that plane, and he sent me something before he died, something troubling." Her eyes lifted, cautious. "I thought it best you saw for yourself." The door opened, and Parker announced the others with stiff formality. They filed in, a tableau of contrasting faces and concealed motives. First was Dr. Bernard Crawley, late 50s, broad-shouldered with the posture of a man who lived behind microscopes and deadlines. His suit was ill-fitting, his tie skewed, eyes sharp but sunken. He nodded brusquely at Miss Marple. Next, Charlotte Whittaker, young and pale, her auburn hair pinned in a bun that wobbled with her nerves. Her gaze darted about like a cornered rabbit. "Miss Marple?" she murmured, voice barely audible. Then came Colonel Richard Vane, polished as his shoes, uniform crisp. His smile was a politician's, warm but calculated. "Always good to see the village taking an interest," he quipped. Something about his ease grated against the room's tension. Professor Hugo Belvoir followed, a tall, thin man with angular features. His dark suit fit too well, his manner too cool. He offered no greeting, only a nod that hovered between courtesy and contempt. Lastly, Isabella Ferreira swept in, a Mediterranean woman whose presence disrupted the gloom. Her scarf was silk, her gaze unwavering. "So this is the famous Miss Marple," she said, lips curving in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I've heard you have a knack for uncovering things best left buried." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Only what people themselves uncover with their words, my dear." They took seats. The air thickened. Secrets hung like smoke. Lady Eleanor reached into a side-table drawer, retrieving a letter folded with precise care. The wax seal was broken, the paper worn from repeated handling. She passed it to Miss Marple. "My dearest Eleanor, if this reaches you, it means what I feared has come to pass. There are forces at work beyond what you or I can control. Project Echo must not fall into the wrong hands. Trust no one, not even those closest. Hidden truths lie beneath our feet. Remember that. Be cautious. Yours always." Alistair Miss Marple read it twice. "Hidden truths beneath our feet," she murmured. Her gaze shifted to the thick rug underfoot, then to the others. Colonel Vane's jaw tightened. Dr. Crawley stared at the hearth. Charlotte's hands twisted in her lap. Belvoir smirked. Isabella arched an eyebrow. "Dramatic, isn't it?" Belvoir said. "Alistair always did fancy himself at the centre of some grand conspiracy." "Perhaps he was," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Or perhaps he simply knew human nature well enough to foresee what greed and fear might provoke." Lady Eleanor's gaze hardened. "I don't trust the authorities. They want it closed, quiet. But Alistair never exaggerated." Her voice cracked only briefly. "If there's danger, still, I can't sit idle." Miss Marple folded the letter. "People often bury more than truth, Lady Eleanor, but no matter how deep, something always finds a way to the surface." She looked at the gathered faces, noting glances exchanged like secret notes passed under a desk. Missed direction, fear, resentments clinging to every word. A puzzle, certainly, but puzzles, Miss Marple knew, were solved piece by careful piece, and sometimes the most telling pieces were the ones left out. The corridors of Hensley Manor stretched long and dim, walls dressed in patterned wallpaper that had once been fashionable but now seemed to suffocate the space with its faded opulence. Lamps, heavy with age and dust, cast pools of yellow light, leaving pockets of shadow in between. It was the sort of place where sound got swallowed. The creak of floorboards, the faint rustle of fabric, all disappearing into the thick silence. Miss Marple, ever polite, clasped her handbag and smiled up at Lady Eleanor. "I do find," she said, "that one can learn quite a bit about a person from their surroundings. Might I trouble you for a brief look around?" Lady Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the gathered guests lingering in the drawing-room, tension coiled in the air behind her, but she nodded. "Of course. Parker will accompany you should you require anything." "Oh, I find I do better without an audience," Miss Marple said gently, her smile as sweet as treacle but with enough firmness to disarm further protest. Lady Eleanor conceded with a faint sigh. "Very well. Sir Alister's study is down the hall. Charlotte, perhaps you could assist?" Her tone suggested that Charlotte's involvement was less about assistance and more about keeping an eye on things. Charlotte Whittaker, looking as though she'd rather face a firing squad, adjusted her cardigan and fell into step beside Miss Marple. The young woman's shoes clicked too loudly on the parquet floor. "It's just, the study is personal," Charlotte murmured. "Sir Alister didn't like people poking about." Miss Marple's reply was mild. "People rarely do, dear. But when someone ends up dead under questionable circumstances, personal boundaries tend to give way to necessity." The study door opened with a creak that seemed to echo longer than it should have. Inside, the room was a curious mix of chaos and order. Papers in neat stacks teetered on the edge of the desk, books crammed into shelves, some spines cracked from use. The air carried the faint scent of tobacco and old ink. Miss Marple took it in with a glance that seemed casual but missed nothing. Her gaze settled on the walls first, degrees framed meticulously, photographs of Sir Alister shaking hands with men in suits who looked important and forgettable at once. A glass case housed medals, most for scientific achievements. But what caught her attention was something that didn't quite fit. An Egyptian statuette, small, bronze, with age-darkened crevices, sat between two silver-framed photos. The artifact's surface was etched with hieroglyphs, the kind often reproduced in museums, though something about it struck Miss Marple as authentic and therefore out of place amid the British accolades. She tilted her head. "That's an interesting piece," she said, her voice light. "Rather exotic for an English inventor." Charlotte shifted uncomfortably. "It was a gift," she said, "from a conference in Cairo last year. He was fascinated by, well, all sorts of things. Technology, ancient cultures. He thought there might be something to learn from how old civilizations communicated." "Curious combination," Miss Marple remarked, stepping closer. Her fingers didn't touch, she never touched without reason, but she leaned in enough to spot a fine layer of dust around the base. Not moved recently, then. Strange that it's displayed so prominently when the rest of the room is rather practical. Charlotte opened her mouth to respond, but closed it again. Her eyes flicked to the door, as though fearing eavesdroppers. "He said it was more than just a souvenir, something about hidden messages. I didn't pay much attention at the time." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "He thought someone was following him, you know, thought it was connected to his work." Miss Marple offered a soft cluck of sympathy. "Genius often attracts complications." Her gaze drifted to the desk, where a fountain pen sat poised above a blotter, the ink dried mid-word. She noted the scattered blueprints, lines and numbers that might have meant something to someone with the training. For her it was the arrangement that mattered, the human touch, or lack thereof. Her eyes caught something else, a corner of paper peeking out from under a ledger. Without ceremony she slid it free. A photograph, aged at the edges. Sir Alister stood beside a man whose face had been torn away, the rip jagged and deliberate. Deliberate destruction rarely spoke of accidents. Charlotte paled. I Didn't know that was there. I imagine there's quite a bit here you didn't know about," Miss Marple said, voice kind, but not letting the comment hang long enough to sting. "People, dear, have a way of keeping compartments in their lives, little drawers filled with secrets, only opened when forced." Charlotte shivered. The room seemed colder somehow. Miss Marple gave the statuette one last look. Hieroglyphs, hidden messages, secrets tucked beneath polished surfaces. Her lips pursed in thought. Accidents, after all, had a way of happening when certain people stood to benefit, and Sir Alistair, for all his brilliance, seemed to have collected more than just artifacts on his travels. He'd collected enemies. Leaving the study, Miss Marple glanced back once. The room looked the same, papers stacked, books lined up, but she knew better. Rooms had memories, and this one was crowded with them. The study's musty air hung thick with the scent of old paper and stale smoke. Miss Marple, methodical as always, moved to the desk's side drawers, her fingertips grazing the polished wood. Locks, she mused, only kept out the well-mannered. The middle drawer resisted, but years of sticky humidity and forced closures yielded a creak as it gave way. Inside, a collection of the mundane, stationery, spare ink cartridges, and a small velvet pouch containing cufflinks. Nestled beneath a sheaf of receipts, she found it. A photograph, edges curled and surface smudged with fingerprints. What drew her attention wasn't the faces, but the absence of one. Sir Alistair's figure remained intact, stiff in posture, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. The man beside him, however, had been torn away with deliberate care, jagged edges betraying haste or anger. Not a clean cut, this was emotional, impulsive. Miss Marple held it up to the light, examining the background. A banquet hall, judging by the linen-draped tables and glittering chandeliers. Cairo, perhaps? There had been talk of a conference. She traced the tear with a finger. People didn't rip photographs for nothing. Behind her, footsteps. She turned as Colonel Richard Vane stepped inside, gaze darting between her and the photograph. "What's that you've got there?" His tone was casual. Too casual. "An odd find," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Photographs are usually kept for remembrance, not mutilation. Curious someone wanted to forget so badly. Any idea who the other gentleman might be?" Her eyes met his. He held the gaze a second too long before glancing away. "No idea," he said, shifting his weight. His hand moved to his pocket, withdrew, then rested on the back of a chair. Nervous energy for a military man. Alistair met a lot of people abroad, can't keep track of them all. "Of course," Miss Marple agreed, folding the photo and slipping it into her handbag. "But I find it's not the people we meet by chance that stick with us. It's the ones we can't forget, no matter how hard we try. Or tear away." Vane's jaw tightened. "You're reading too much into it." "Perhaps." Her smile didn't waver. "But sometimes the smallest details unravel the largest lies. You'd be surprised how often that's true." He muttered something under his breath and excused himself, footsteps echoing down the hall. Miss Marple watched the door close behind him, mind already piecing together a chain of possibilities. People always spoke too much when they were hiding something. Vane's tongue, it seemed, was working overtime. Drawers exhausted, her attention shifted to Sir Alistair's leather briefcase on the floor beside the desk. The leather was worn, corners scuffed, but the brass clasps gleamed. Well used, but well maintained. She knelt, careful not to scuff her stockings, and clicked it open. Inside, papers in neat bundles, blueprints folded with precision, and a notebook with cryptic diagrams that meant little to her at a glance. Her gaze, however, snagged on the lining, a frayed edge, small but enough. Gently she peeled it back. There, stitched into the fabric, was threadwork that didn't belong. White against the dark lining, zigzagging in deliberate rows, knitting, or something close enough to it. "Men," she murmured with mild amusement, "always think a secret's safe if it's complicated, but most things in life are just patterns, really." Fetching a pencil and scrap paper from the desk, she began decoding knit, purl, knit. Her mind worked as her needles would. 10 minutes in, a phrase emerged: project echo. A reverberation, something that repeats, or listens. More lines followed, trickier to untangle. By the end, a second phrase: the roots of betrayal. She sat back on her heels, frowning thoughtfully. Betrayal suggested personal motives: money, pride, love. Echo hinted at something technological, or perhaps something simpler: information. People had killed for less. Closing the briefcase, she wiped her hands on her skirt and rose, knees protesting. Outside the window, the manor grounds stretched under a grey sky, peaceful on the surface like a pond with a corpse sunk beneath. Her gaze lingered on the garden paths. Roots, betrayal, hidden truths beneath their feet. Patterns and secrets, she murmured. Same as knitting. Tight at first glance, but pull the right thread, and it all unravels. The real question wasn't what Sir Alister had been hiding, it was who had decided he wouldn't live to reveal it. Hensley Manor felt heavier as the day wore on, its walls seeming to close in with every whispered word and sideways glance. Lady Eleanor had arranged for Miss Marple to conduct her inquiries in the small morning room, a misnomer now, given the gathering storm clouds beyond the windows. The room smelled faintly of lemon polish and old secrets. Miss Marple settled herself in an armchair, notebook resting on her lap, pen poised like a knitting needle. One by one the suspects filed in. Each sat across from her in the wing-back chair opposite. A confessional of sorts, though few were eager to confess. Dr. Bernard Crawley entered first, shoulders tight beneath a worn brown suit. His thinning hair was slicked back in an effort that spoke of morning rush rather than vanity. He sat heavily, legs spread, arms crossed. A man braced for confrontation. "You're wasting your time," he began, voice gravelly. "I didn't have a hand in this." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Oh, I rarely consider time wasted when understanding people. Your relationship with Sir Alister was complicated, wasn't it?" His jaw tightened. "He was brilliant, no denying that, but brilliant men can be blind. I spent years working beside him, my ideas, my research. And when recognition came, it was his name on the papers, not mine. That must have been frustrating." He laughed without humour. "Frustrating, sure, but murder? No. I wanted credit, not a funeral. Look, I stayed because, well, loyalty's a hard habit to break. He wasn't all bad, just consumed by that damned project. Project Echo?" His gaze flicked away. "If you know the name, you know enough to leave it alone." Miss Marple's pen scratched softly on the page. "Sometimes leaving things alone leads to worse trouble." Crowley stood. "I didn't kill him, Miss Marple." "That's all you need from me." He left with a glance that lingered just long enough to hint at something unsaid. Charlotte arrived next, eyes red-rimmed, handkerchief twisting in trembling fingers. Her cardigan sagged off one shoulder as if she'd forgotten how clothes should sit. "It's horrible," she whispered, sinking into the chair. "He was kind to me, more than anyone else here." "You worked closely with Sir Alister," Miss Marple said softly. "Some say perhaps too closely." Charlotte flushed, gaze dropping to her lap. "I cared for him, I won't deny that, but he didn't see me that way." A tear slid free. "He was obsessed with his work. I thought if I helped enough, stayed late, maybe he'd—" Her voice cracked. "But he didn't." Miss Marple reached over, patting her hand. "Unrequited affection is its own tragedy, but you must know how jealousy can look to others." Charlotte's eyes widened. "I didn't. No, I wanted him to be happy, even if it wasn't with me. I never would hurt him. People do odd things when emotions tangle with pride." Charlotte shook her head fiercely. "Not me. I just wanted to matter." Miss Marple made a note. Wanting to matter could be motive enough. Sometimes. Colonel Richard Vane entered briskly, uniform impeccable, the clack of his polished shoes echoing sharp in the small room. He sat like a man at a court-martial, rigid, arms resting on the chair arms with military precision. "This is all a waste," he declared. "Sir Alistair was playing with fire. Secrets like those attract attention from the wrong quarters." "Yours included?" Miss Marple asked mildly. His lips thinned. "National security is no game, Miss Marple. We had an interest in what he was developing, so did others. We wanted to ensure it didn't end up in foreign hands." "And if he refused to share?" Vane's gaze was flinty. "We don't resort to murder, if that's your insinuation. He was a civilian asset, valuable. Dead men aren't useful." "Sometimes dead men stop being a liability," she murmured. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing further. When he left, the air seemed to lose 10 degrees of tension. Professor Hugo Belvoir sauntered in next, dark suit immaculate, fingers tapping a rhythm against the chair as he sat. "So, the village sleuth seeks motive and means. Have you considered mere chance, Miss Marple? Sometimes planes crash, no conspiracy required." "Planes do crash," she agreed. "But letters predicting danger and torn photographs suggest otherwise." His smile was thin. "Alistair thrived on paranoia. You've seen the man's work, layers upon layers. Not everything is sinister, yet you stand to benefit, do you not? Academic prestige, He shrugged. "Prestige, perhaps. But I didn't need Alistair's death for that. Our collaboration was distant. He didn't share much toward the end. Obsessed with echo." "You didn't find that curious?" Belvoir leaned forward, gaze cool. "In academia, people hoard ideas like misers hoard coins." Alistair was no different. He stood, brushing non-existent lint from his jacket. "People overcomplicate things, Miss Marple. Not every secret leads to murder." "Perhaps not," she murmured. "But people do." Isabella Ferreira last came Isabella, heels clicking a rhythm as she settled gracefully into the chair, legs crossed, eyes gleaming with something between amusement and challenge. "Miss Marple," she drawled, "what secrets are you hoping to pry from me?" "Journalists often find themselves where trouble brews," Miss Marple said, "and Sir Alistair seemed wary of attention." Isabella smiled. "Wary? He was a fortress. But walls crumble, Miss Marple. I was chasing a story, nothing more. Technology like his, it changes the world. People deserve to know." "And if exposing that story hurt him?" Her smile faded. "You think I'd kill for a headline? There are limits." "People always say that," Miss Marple mused, "until they find a reason to cross them." Isabella's gaze didn't waver. "I got close to him for the truth, but murder... That's too messy for ink and paper." As Isabella left, Miss Marple sat back, the room empty save for the ticking clock and the faint drizzle tapping the window pane. Pride, ambition, jealousy, threads tangled tighter than any knitting pattern. And somewhere in that weave lay the truth. Her gaze drifted to her notes. Project Echo, the roots of betrayal. Secrets had a way of surfacing. The question was who had the most to lose if they did. The Manners Library was the sort of place built to impress. Tall shelves groaning with leather-bound volumes, the scent of old paper mingling with the faint musk of pipe smoke. Dark wood panelling absorbed what little light filtered through heavy velvet curtains. In the centre, a Persian rug stretched out like a trap, edges curling with age. Miss Marple stood near the hearth, fingertips grazing the spines of books, arranged more for show than use. Her eyes, pale but sharp, scanned titles. Naval histories, philosophy of machines, Egyptian symbolism. Oddly eclectic for a man so focused on modern technology. She paused at a gap in the shelves where dust patterns betrayed something recently removed. Her gaze shifted to the adjacent shelf, slightly scuffed near the floor. A draught kissed her ankle, subtle, deliberate. Crouching, she pressed against the wood. Resistance, then a soft click. The section of shelving creaked inward on hidden hinges, revealing darkness beyond. She glanced over her shoulder. Empty room, empty hall, then stepped through. The door swung shut behind her with a thud that seemed louder in the hush. Narrow stairs descended into a cool, close-smelling passage, walls rough with stone, pipes lining the ceiling like metallic veins. Her shoes echoed softly, measured steps against the chill. At the base of the stairs, another door, metal, heavy. She tried the handle. It yielded with surprising ease. Light flickered overhead, one bare bulb casting a pool of yellow onto concrete floors stained with oil and time. The underground workshop sprawled out, cluttered yet purposeful. Tables groaned under the weight of tools, wiring and mechanical parts. Blueprints, some pinned to cork boards, others strewn across surfaces, depicted circuits and antenna arrays that would baffle most laymen. For Miss Marple it was less about understanding the technicalities and more about reading the intent, the human hand behind the mess. A photograph on the workbench caught her eye. Sir Alister, younger, flanked by men in military uniforms. No names, no date. Faces partly obscured. One man's smile incongruent with the solemnity of the others. She tucked it into her handbag. Another piece of the puzzle. The room buzzed faintly. Not mechanical, but the kind of hum that came from knowing secrets sat close enough to touch. In the far corner, half shrouded by a dust-stained tarp, something larger loomed. Miss Marple pulled the fabric aside, revealing a device that looked cobbled together from a radio set, military hardware, and an engineer's fever dream. Wires snaked across its surface, dials and knobs labelled with cryptic abbreviations. Above it, scrawled notes peppered with exclamation marks and underlined warnings. Unauthorized access prohibited. Testing frequencies unstable. Echo must not fall into the wrong hands. Her gaze drifted to a leather-bound journal nearby. She flipped it open. Sir Alister's handwriting, precise, impatient. Echo is functional beyond expectations. Ability to intercept military frequencies confirmed. Danger of global misuse high. Refuse to sell to government. Morally untenable. Eleanor worried. Told her truth but kept technical details hidden. If you find this and I am gone, it was no accident. A pause, her brow knitting. Intercepting communications. In the wrong hands, the device could dismantle defences, manipulate strategies, end lives without a single bullet fired. And Sir Alister, idealist or fool, thought keeping it secret would keep people safe. Secrets don't stay buried, she murmured, glancing around. No surveillance cameras. Too modern for a man who trusted mechanics over electronics. But someone had known. Someone desperate enough to silence him. Her gaze returned to the machine. It stood silent now, but the implications echoed louder than any whirring gears. Roots of betrayal, indeed. She closed the journal, slipping it into her bag. Footsteps creaked above, too heavy for the settling house. Time to go. Miss Marple retraced her steps, each footfall measured. Secrets, she thought, were like knitting. Pull one wrong thread and the whole pattern unravels. Problem was, someone had pulled hard enough to strangle a man. St.Mary Mead didn't change much, even when murder hovered on the air. The village square remained a patchwork of cobblestone, gossip and routine. Doors creaked open, curtains twitched, and the postman delivered letters with the same casual nods, oblivious to the tension brewing beneath the surface. It was the kind of place where a stranger couldn't blink without someone remarking on it by tea-time. Miss Marple strolled toward the greengrocer, hat angled just so, sensible shoes tapping out a patient rhythm. She didn't hurry. Information came easier to those who appeared not to need it. Outside the shop, Mrs. Petherick was elbow-deep in parsnips, tongue clucking over prices. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," she chirked. "Bit of a chill today, isn't it? Weather's odd for the season, or maybe it's just everything else that feels off." Miss Marple smiled. Oddness does seem to be making the rounds. She selected a modest bunch of carrots, waited. Mrs. Petherick glanced around, lowered her voice. A stage whisper, carrying half across the square. "Speaking of odd, saw that Professor Belvoir and that foreign woman, Miss Ferreira, having a drink at the inn last night. Cosy little corner table, heads close. Didn't look like casual conversation to me." "Indeed?" Miss Marple's tone was light, but a spark of interest flickered in her eyes. "They don't strike me as compatible company." "That's what I said." Mrs. Petterick beamed at the validation. "She's all charm and smiles, and he's colder than my Albert stew leftovers. Something's brewing there, mark my words. People find the most curious alliances when circumstances demand it," Miss Marple murmured. "Or when they share secrets." Mrs. Petterick leaned in. "You think she's mixed up in that business with Sir Alister? Town's buzzing about it, not that anyone wants to say so aloud, what with the Hensleys being who they are." Miss Marple offered a knowing smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Petterick. Carrots look lovely." As she left, the church bells chimed, echoing through the streets like a reminder. Gossip wasn't always truth, but it was rarely born of nothing. Back at Hensley Manor, the atmosphere had thickened. Conversations were clipped, eyes darted to shadows. Miss Marple requested a word with Professor Belvoir. He obliged, though not without a sigh that suggested he had better things to do, though what could be more pressing than clearing one's name was anyone's guess. They sat in the conservatory. Outside rain drizzled against the glass roof, each drop a muted drumbeat. Belvoir crossed one leg over the other, posture relaxed, eyes sharp. "You've been busy, Miss Marple," he said. "Digging, prying, you do enjoy a puzzle." "Only when lives are at stake," she replied. "Mrs. Petterick mentioned seeing you with Miss Ferreira. Unusual, given your earlier insistence on detachment." He smiled thinly. "Isabella pursues stories. I pursue facts. Sometimes those paths cross. I assume you think we're conspiring. I find unlikely pairings often bear the most fruit. Speaking of which, this grudge of yours against the Hensleys. Care to explain?" His expression shuddered. "Old history. My grandfather worked under Alistair's father. Brilliant man, but let's say ambition ran thicker than loyalty. Ideas were taken, credits stolen, legacies rewritten. My family was left with scraps while the Hensleys climbed every ladder." "Revenge is a powerful motivator," she said softly. Belvoir's gaze hardened. "You think I killed him for an old slight? He didn't need help dying. His paranoia did that. You should ask Eleanor why she's so desperate to keep certain truths buried." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Such as?" But Belvoir stood, brushing off his trousers. "Dig deep enough, Miss Marple, and you might not like what you find." She watched him leave, rain streaking down the glass between them. Words like his weren't warnings. They were invitations. The air inside Hensley Manor held the stillness of a held breath. Shadows, thick and stretching, crept along the walls as the grandfather clock in the hall groaned and struck 11:30. The house had settled into uneasy silence, the kind that presses against your ears until you hear your own pulse. Miss Marple, clad in her usual sensible tweed suit, moved with quiet purpose along the upper corridor, the hem of her skirt brushed against the carpet runner, its floral pattern faded with age and foot traffic. Her knitting needles were safely tucked away tonight. She needed both hands free. Not that she was one for dramatics, but there was something unsettling about the evening's earlier conversations. Too many polite smiles hiding something darker. Polite English villages, she often said, could be as dangerous as city alleyways, only with better manners. A faint creak echoed. Floorboards. Someone awake. Or waiting. Miss Marple paused, eyes narrowing. The corridor stretched before her, punctuated by heavy oak doors and the ornate staircase at the far end. Her gaze drifted to the stairs. Their dark mahogany gleam barely caught the flickering glow from the wall sconces. Candlelight danced, casting long fingers of shadow that played tricks on the eyes. She heard it again. A shift of weight, a breath held too long. "Oh dear," she murmured, though her tone remained calm. "I do believe someone's making a rather poor attempt at skulking." With deliberate slowness she stepped forward, shoes making barely a sound. Her hand brushed the smooth wallpaper, damask, expensive, just to steady herself. Each step was calculated. At her age one didn't rush unless knitting sales were involved. Then it happened. As she reached the top of the staircase, a shadow lunged from behind a tall decorative urn. It was quick, too quick, but so was she in her own way. Reflexes sharpened by years of noticing what others didn't. Fingers, gloves, she noted absently, pressed hard against her back. The push was forceful, calculated. Not panic, but intent. But Miss Marple, ever the observer, had anticipated something amiss. She twisted, pivoting slightly, and the shove sent her sideways rather than forward. Her shoulder grazed the banister. Pain bloomed, sharp and immediate, but she held on, knuckles whitening, as her feet scrambled for purchase. "Really?" she said, breathless but composed. "That was rather rude." The figure bolted, footsteps pounding down the corridor. Miss Marple, heart pounding but mind sharp, didn't give chase. That wasn't her way. Instead, she steadied herself, fingers brushing the tender spot on her shoulder. Eyes like sharpened steel followed the shadow until it vanished into darkness. Below, the manor remained still. No cries, no alarms. Hensley Manor's grand halls swallowed sound like secrets swallowed the truth. Straightening her jacket with quiet dignity, she glanced at the stairs again. A fall from there would have done the job, quick and tidy, no mess. Whoever it was wanted her quieted, but not obviously. An accident. How neat. Her lips thin. "Close," she whispered, "far too close." Downstairs, the grandfather clock resumed its slow, ponderous ticking. Later, seated in a high-backed armchair in her guest room, Miss Marple dabbed her shoulder with a cold compress. The room was richly furnished. Plush armchair, heavy drapes. But it felt less welcoming now. The night outside pressed against the window panes, black and full of whispers. She reviewed the evening's conversations, Colonel Vane's clipped speech, his gaze darting when Sir Alister's study was mentioned, Charlotte Whittaker's nervous glances, her fingers twisting that satchel strap until the leather creaked, Professor Belvoir's disdainful smirks, too practised, and Lady Hensley's grief-tinged composure, just a shade too perfect. And Isabella Ferreira, charming, observant. Her questions had pride, polite yet pointed. Journalists had a way of peeling layers until the bones showed. The attempt on her life, well, a slight shove, really, but no less serious, confirmed it. She was getting close. People didn't shove you downstairs for idle gossip. No, this was fear. Fear that she might unravel something best left knotted. A faint smile crept to her lips. Good. Fear meant someone was worried. And worried people made mistakes. Setting the compress aside, she reached for her notebook. The pages were filled with neat, looping handwriting. Observations, snippets of overheard conversations, details so small most wouldn't bother. But Miss Marple knew murder was often in the minutiae. Her pencil paused. One name, underlined twice. Sir Alister's study. Secrets lived there. She'd stake her best knitting needles on it. Outside, the wind sighed against the manor's stones. Inside, the detective smiled a little wider. The game was afoot, and someone in Hensley Manor was running out of moves. The grand drawing-room of Hensley Manor hadn't seen this many people since the last charity gala, though the air now was thicker, less champagne, more suspicion. The walls, lined with sombre oil paintings of long-dead Hensleys, seemed to watch from their frames. Heavy velvet drapes dulled the afternoon light, casting long shadows over the ornate furniture. A fire sputtered in the hearth, more for atmosphere than warmth. Miss Marple sat at the centre of it all, looking as out of place as a cat in a henhouse, and just as dangerous. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, silver glinting with each measured movement. It was calming, that rhythmic sound, but it also frayed nerves. People tended to talk when you gave them enough silence. She glanced over her spectacles. "We're all here, then," she said, voice as soft as a tea-cake but carrying enough weight to quiet the room. Her gaze swept over the assembled guests. Colonel Richard Vane stood by the liquor cart, one hand curled around a glass of brandy that he hadn't sipped. His uniform was impeccable. So was his mask of impatience. Charlotte Whittaker, seated near the window, twisted her handkerchief until it looked like it might unravel. Professor Hugo Belvoir leaned against the mantel, arms folded, face carved from something smug and unyielding. Isabella Ferreira perched on the arm of a chair, legs crossed, eyes flicking between everyone like she was mapping an escape route. Lady Eleanor Hensey, all grace and pearl, stood with her back straight, though grief pulled at the corners of her mouth. "Miss Marple," she said, voice carefully even, "if you have answers, I'd prefer you get to them. We've all waited long enough." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple replied. "I imagine patience is in short supply," the knitting needles clicked on. "Murder has a way of shortening tempers." Belvoir snorted. "Is this going somewhere, or are we here for a yarn-spinning session?" "Patience," Miss Marple repeated, not looking up. "I find it helpful to lay things out properly. Like a good tapestry, you see, the pattern only becomes clear once all the threads are visible." She paused, knitting needles still for the first time. Her blue eyes, sharp as fresh frost, met each gaze in turn. "Sir Alistair Hensley discovered something remarkable. His invention would have changed more than he anticipated. Some thought that was too dangerous." She glanced at Colonel Vane. "Didn't they?" Vane's jaw tightened. "National security isn't a game if certain technologies fall into the wrong hands." "Oh, indeed. But one wonders if the greater danger wasn't in the invention's misuse, but in the fear of losing control. Suppressing it, Colonel, was never going to be clean." Her knitting resumed, calm and methodical. "And you were certainly not the only interested party." Her gaze shifted to Belvoir. "Professor Belvoir, espionage is such an ugly word, but it fits, doesn't it? You weren't just interested in Sir Alistair's work. You aimed to steal it. You disguised it as academic rivalry, but your methods were rather less scholarly." Belvoir's lips curled. "You've no proof." "Proof?" Miss Marple shrugged. "One doesn't need a signed confession when patterns emerge. You tried to outsmart him. Unfortunately for you, Sir Alistair was smarter still. He found out." The professor's silence was louder than any protest. Miss Marple turned to Isabella. "And you, my dear, unwittingly caught in the middle, delivering documents, thinking they were harmless. I dare say you thought it was just another lead for your article." Isabella stiffened. I didn't. No, Miss Marple said gently. "You didn't. But ignorance, I'm afraid, doesn't absolve involvement." Charlotte's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the tension. "So, Sir Alistair confronted them?" "Oh, he confronted someone, all right," Miss Marple said. "He realized how dangerous things had become. Tried to contain it." Her gaze rested on Vane. "But fear makes people rash, doesn't it, Colonel?" Vane's knuckles whitened on the glass. He was going to hand it over to the press. Create chaos. "Or transparency," Miss Marple countered. "Depends on the lens you use." Silence settled like dust in a forgotten room. Then, quietly, Lady Eleanor spoke. "So, which of them killed him?" Miss Marple's knitting stopped. "That's the thing about tapestries, Lady Eleanor. Sometimes the brightest thread hides the deepest flaw." She stood, slow but steady. Her shoulder ached, a reminder of last night's near miss, but her voice was clear. "The one who feared exposure most wasn't the thief or the soldier." Her gaze slid to the door. "It was someone much closer to home." The room held its breath. Footsteps echoed in the hall. Miss Marple smiled, not kindly, not now. "The pattern is complete," she said, "and someone's about to unravel." The rain outside Hensley Manor tapped against the windows, steady and patient, as if it too waited for answers. Inside the grand drawing-room, tension coiled tighter than a watch-spring. The fire crackled but gave off little warmth. People stood, sat, shifted, everyone except Miss Marple. She remained still, her knitting resting on her lap like a cat that had finally settled after a long day. Professor Hugo Belvoir paced. His footsteps were sharp against the hardwood floor, echoing off the high ceilings. "This is nonsense," he snapped, though his voice wavered. "Revenge? Sabotage? I'm a scholar, not a criminal." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh, but scholars are human, Professor. prone to the same flaws as the rest of us, greed, pride, bitterness. Her gaze didn't waver. Yours was personal. Generations of your family felt wronged by the Hensleys. Sir Alister's invention was merely the final straw. Belvoir's face twisted. You think I'd risk my reputation over an old family feud? Yes, she said simply. Ancestral grudges have a way of simmering under the surface until something, or someone, stokes the fire. Her knitting needles resumed their soft click-click. You didn't just want the invention stopped. You wanted the Hensley name tarnished, ruined. Colonel Vane growled. He sabotaged the plane. That's attempted murder. Successful murder, Miss Marple corrected gently. Sir Alister didn't survive after all. Belvoir's defiance crumbled. His shoulders sagged under the weight of exposure. He deserved it, he muttered. Decades of my family's work stolen. My grandfather's designs buried under Hensley patents. I tried diplomacy, letters, meetings. Nothing worked. So you reached out to certain foreign contacts, Miss Marple said. Academic conferences can be terribly convenient for secret dealings, easy to pass off as research collaborations. Belvoir laughed, bitter. You think you understand? They promised to shelve Project Echo permanently, said they'd make sure no country got it. And you believed them? Isabella's voice cracked. Her eyes, usually sharp with journalistic hunger, were wide with disbelief. You dragged me into this. I thought I was chasing a story, not delivering blueprints to spies. Belvoir shrugged. You wanted the truth? Sometimes it's uglier than you expect, Miss Marple sighed. It often is. Her knitting paused as two uniformed constables entered. Gentlemen, if you'd be so kind. Belvoir didn't resist. As they cuffed him, he shot a final look at Lady Eleanor. Your husband was a thief, remember that? Lady Eleanor, standing tall despite the storm inside her, said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. The manor emptied quickly after that. Rain washed away footprints on the gravel drive as cars rumbled off into the dark. By midnight, Hensley Manor was quiet again. Miss Marple sat alone in the small parlour, a cup of tea warming her hands. The storm outside softened to a drizzle. She gazed into the fireplace, watching embers glow and crumble. Lady Eleanor had made her decision swiftly. Project Echo's files were to be destroyed. Too much blood for something that should have helped, she'd said. Practical, grieving, wise. Isabella had left shaken, vowing to pursue stories that illuminated truth rather than obscured it. No more shadows, she'd said. Miss Marple believed her. People often changed after seeing the cost of ambition, and Belvoir, well, prison bars wouldn't undo his past, but justice, even late, was better than none. Miss Marple took a sip of her tea. It had cooled. No matter. Her gaze drifted to the window, where dawn's first light teased the horizon. It's always the small things, she murmured. A missed stitch, a loose thread. That's what unravels everything. She set the cup down. Outside, the village of St.Mary Mead stretched and stirred, unaware of how close it had brushed danger. Just as well. Life was full of dark corners. But thankfully people like her kept a torch handy. Smiling faintly, Miss Marple reached for her knitting. Patterns, after all, didn't knit themselves. The morning train whistled through the valley, sending up a cloud of steam that curled against the pale sky. Today at the St. Mary Mead station, the platform was slick with last night's rain. Wood planks darkened and glistening. Travellers in hats and wool coats clustered beneath the iron awning, voices muted beneath the huffing locomotive. Miss Marple stood a little apart, gloved hands folded neatly around her handbag. Her hat, practical and unfussy, shielded her from the cold breeze that nipped at the edges of her coat. She watched the bustle with mild interest. Goodbyes were curious things. Part ritual, part relief. Beside her, Lady Eleanor Hensley appeared composed as ever, though lines of exhaustion tugged at the corners of her eyes. Her gloved fingers played with the silver clasp of her handbag, a habit betraying nerves otherwise held in check. I can't say I'll miss this place, Isabella Ferrara muttered, adjusting the strap on her satchel. Her dark hair, pinned back hastily, caught a stray breeze. No offence, of course. Her gaze flicked toward Miss Marple, half apologetic. "Villages aren't for me. Too many secrets." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Secrets are everywhere, dear. Villagers just don't bother hiding them as well as cities do." The conductor's voice called final boarding. Luggage thumped onto the racks. Conversations quickened. Colonel Vane, already on the train, shot a last glance out the window. Face unreadable, but eyes calculating. Professor Belvoir wouldn't be boarding. His journey had taken a different route, one lined with barred windows and official papers. Isabella hesitated at the steps. "Look, I didn't know. About the documents, about, well, any of it. Feels like I should have seen it coming." "Most of us don't see what's right under our noses," Miss Marple said gently. "That's how lies work. They dress up as something familiar." Isabella sighed. "Guess I'll be double-checking sources from now on." She managed a half-smile. "Take care, Miss Marple." "And you, dear," Miss Marple replied. "Truth's worth chasing, but do mind how close you stand to the edge next time." With a wave, Isabella climbed aboard. The train hissed, steel groaning against steel. Passengers settled. Porters called out warnings. Life, Miss Marple thought, had a habit of moving on whether you were ready or not. Lady Eleanor remained silent until the doors slid shut. Only then did she speak, voice low. "You think it's truly over?" Miss Marple glanced down the track, steam curling like ghostly fingers over the rails. "Endings are neat things in books, Lady Eleanor. Life's messier. Loose threads here and there. Someone always pulls at one eventually." Eleanor nodded slowly. Sir Alister thought he was doing something noble. Saving lives. And look what it cost. "There's a difference between noble intentions and reckless ambition," Miss Marple murmured. "He meant well. People often do." The train lurched forward. Wheels clacked a steady rhythm that faded as carriages pulled away, shrinking into the morning haze. Eleanor watched until the last car disappeared. Silence swelled in its place, broken only by a gull's distant cry and the station clock ticking off another second. "I destroyed the blueprints," Eleanor said after a beat. "Burned them myself, but—" her fingers tightened on the clasp. "What if there are copies? Hugo mentioned a foreign backer. I can't bear the thought it might resurface." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Fear's a heavy coat to wear, dear, but worry only does what guilt can't finish." Eleanor gave a soft, rueful laugh. "You have a way of cutting to the quick." "I knit a great deal," Miss Marple said dryly. "Patterns become obvious after enough practice." Together they turned away from the empty tracks. The village, still waking, spread out beyond the station, a patchwork of rooftops, cobbled streets and chimneys sending up thin smoke trails. Life resumed. Bread to buy, gossip to exchange, letters to post. The world, indifferent to tragedy, spun on, just enough to catch on the damp streets, making them glisten like silver threads woven through the day. She smiled to herself. Loose threads, always there if you knew where to look. The train dwindled into the horizon, trailing a plume of smoke that smudged the clear morning sky. On the platform, the lingering scent of coal and steam hung in the air. Miss Marple stood alone now, gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag, eyes fixed on the receding blur of metal and distance. The station clock ticked steadily, marking the passage of time with a casual indifference to human affairs. She frowned. Not at the train, nor at the departing passengers, but at the question that clung stubbornly to her mind, like a burr on wool. Professor Belvoir's confession had fit the facts. Motivated by family resentment, aided by foreign opportunists, it all made sense. Too much sense, perhaps. Real life, she knew, rarely wrapped itself in a neat package. Loose ends, like the ones dangling from a rushed hem, always had a way of snagging. Her gaze shifted to the empty track. Belvoir, proud, bitter, cornered, had revealed just enough to be convincing. But what if that had been the plan all along? He was a man used to games, to strategies unfolding across lecture halls and private studies. Had he truly been the architect of this deadly scheme, or just a piece moved by an unseen hand? Behind her, the station began to return to its village rhythm. Porters stacked leftover baggage. A woman in a cloche hat haggled with the ticket clerk over a missed connection. Nearby, a boy dragged a wooden toy train through a puddle, wheels splashing in perfect mimicry of the real thing. Life, Miss Marple thought, was good at moving on. Her mind less so. The foreign backers, that phrase lingered. Convenient scapegoats in times like these. Whispers of shadowy figures across borders, plotting from smoke-filled rooms. Belvoir had hinted at contact made under the cover of academic exchange. Yet something about the timing, the urgency, the violence, it spoke of stakes beyond old grudges and stolen patents. Greed and revenge, those were common. But fear, that ran deeper. And then there was Sir Alister's invention, Project Echo. So much fuss over something that Lady Eleanor claimed to have destroyed, but people didn't kill over ideas, unless those ideas were still breathing somewhere. Paper could burn, but knowledge had a habit of surviving, in sketches tucked away, conversations half-remembered, minds too clever for their own good. Miss Marple sighed, the sound small in the open air. She adjusted her hat against a rising breeze, carrying with it the faintest trace of smoke and damp leaves. Autumn crept in early this year, sneaking around corners before anyone had cleared away summer's remnants. The thoughts circled back, as they often did, to character. Belvoir's rage had been personal, but what of those others? Colonel Vane's rigid patriotism, a convenient mask for self-interest? Isabella Ferrera's ambition? Reckless, yes, but easily manipulated? And Lady Eleanor, grief sharpened by guilt? People wore their motives like well-tailored coats, covering, flattering, but always revealing if you looked at the seam. A station porter passed by, tipping his cap. "Train'll be in London by noon, miss." "Will it?" she said absently. London, where answers sometimes waited in dusty archives or whispered through drawing rooms, or, more likely, where questions just changed their coats. Miss Marple lingered another moment. Watching the horizon was a habit, she supposed, not for the view but for what lay beyond it. Answers, perhaps, or just more smoke. Turning at last, she headed down the platform. Her steps were measured, steady, the sort that knew haste seldom improved clarity. St.Mary Mead awaited, with its tidy hedges and nosy neighbours and teacups that held as many secrets as stories. There'd be talk at the post office, glances exchanged over milk deliveries. People moved on, mysteries though, they lingered. As she reached the station gate, she paused. The boy with the toy train splashed through another puddle, oblivious to the world beyond his game. Miss Marple smiled, a thin, knowing curve of her lips. "It's always the same," she murmured. "A train leaves, another arrives, but the tracks, they never change." And with that she stepped back into the village, shadows stretching long behind her as the morning sun climbed steadily upward. St.Mary Mead basked in the kind of morning that made people believe trouble lived elsewhere. Sunlight spilled lazily over thatched roofs, and smoke curled gently from chimneys like contented sighs. The cobblestone streets gleamed from last night's rain, fresh enough to glisten but dry enough not to soak shoes. Life, for all appearances, had returned to its usual pace, slow, predictable, comfortable. In her modest garden, Miss Marple knelt among her rose bushes, pruning shears, snipping with efficient precision. The scent of damp earth mingled with the sweetness of blooming tea roses. Her hat, a practical straw affair, shielded her face from the sun's glare as she leaned in, careful not to snag her skirt on the thorny branches. She hummed a tune under her breath, a habit when the world seemed quieter than her mind. The events at Hensley Manor felt both distant and stubbornly present, like a dream half-remembered but impossible to shake. Murder, espionage, deceit, words too sharp for a village that prided itself on rhubarb competitions and charity teas. Yet, under the trimmed hedges and freshly painted doors, people had a way of hiding rot. Human nature rarely changed, it just polished its surface. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Morning, Miss Marple. Out with the roses again, I see." Miss Marple glanced up to find Mrs. Petherick standing at the garden gate, clutching her shopping basket. The woman's hat, far too large for her face, bobbed as she spoke, Mrs. Petherick was the kind of neighbour who knew everyone's business and, when she didn't, filled in the blanks with impressive creativity. "Good morning, dear," Miss Marple replied. "Lovely day for it." Mrs. Petherick glanced at the roses, but seemed more interested in the occupant behind them. "It's the first dry morning we've had all week. Thought I'd fetch a few things before the shops ran out. Oh, you wouldn't believe what I heard at the grocer's." Miss Marple smiled, wiping dirt from her gloves. "Something terribly shocking, I imagine." "Oh, you don't know the half of it." Mrs. Petherick lowered her voice, though no one else was around. "New people moving into the old Sanderson place, city folk. Him in banking, I hear, or was it shipping? Either way, money like you wouldn't believe. And the wife, dreadful taste in curtains, poor thing. Ethel saw them through the window, bright green with orange trim, can you imagine?" Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Not the sort to suit our little village, I dare say." "That's what I said." Mrs. Petherick nodded vigorously. "And you know how newcomers are, stirring things up, asking questions, wanting changes. Next thing you know, we'll have a cinema right on the high street." She paused. "Though I wouldn't mind seeing one of those moving pictures. They say the talking ones are marvellous. Progress marches on," Miss Marple mused. "Though sometimes it's best when it walks rather than runs." Mrs. Petherick leaned closer. "Did you hear about poor Mrs. Weatherby's cat? Gone missing again, 3rd time this month. Some say it's foxes, but I heard tell there's a boy down on Miller's Lane with a slingshot. Terrible upbringing." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic nod, but her gaze drifted to the horizon, where the village rooftops gave way to open field. The landscape looked peaceful, serene even, but beneath that tranquillity life carried on with its secrets and lies. Belvoir's arrest, Lady Eleanor's grief, Isabella's shaken resolve, all resolved neatly enough on paper, but human hearts were messier things, and somewhere beyond the reach of village gossip and rose petals the world's shadows lengthened, waiting. Mrs. Petherick followed her gaze, oblivious. "Well, I must be off. The butcher's got a special on pork chops, and you know how Mr. Petherick gets if his supper's late." "Of course, dear. Wouldn't want to be the cause of domestic discord." With a final nod and a cheerful wave, Mrs. Petherick bustled down the lane, her basket swinging. Miss Marple watched her go, the corners of her mouth lifting in amusement. Gossip was a currency here, spent freely, never running dry. Turning back to her roses, she clipped a withered bloom, letting it fall among the soil. Life was like that, she thought. Things died, others bloomed, secrets got buried, only to sprout when least expected. She paused, wiping a speck of dirt from her cheek. Yes, things had settled, for now, but in a world where people lied for love, killed for pride, and whispered behind lace curtains, normalcy was just another mask, and masks had a way of slipping. Miss Marple straightened, stretching her back. Time for tea. Answers rarely waited for invitations, but reflection always brewed best in a teapot. Humming again, she gathered her tools and headed inside, the roses swaying gently in the breeze behind her, bright, beautiful, and sharp as ever.